Good morning, everyone, and I want to thank Annie Larkin for setting up our programming today. She's our Director of Community Engagement. My name is Eric Caldwell. I'm the President and CEO of the Amerind. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. For the talk, Mom, You'll Be Home by Summer, a Diné Story of Cancer, Death, Grief, and Hope, with Dr. Jennifer Denetdale, Professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. Professor Denetdale has spoken at Amerind on several prior occasions, and we are always grateful for the expertise, scholarship, and insight that she shared with our audience. I'm honored to be able to welcome her back to Amerind today. Before I turn the program over to her, we want to acknowledge that Amerind is located in southern Arizona, on lands where Apache, Hopi, and Oshwe families lived for untold generations, and whose wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We're grateful for all that these communities, rich in history, have to teach us. Amerind's mission is to foster and promote an understanding and knowledge of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, conservation, education, and community engagement. Our museum exhibits, workshops, and online programs like this one help us fulfill our education and community engagement mission. Artists, historians, community elders, and others have kindly and generously shared their thoughts with the Amerind community in ways that enrich our understanding with an array of topics, from contemporary issues to deep historical roots. We are very blessed by these wise and wonderful teachers like Dr. Denetdale, who make our programs possible. Our Amerind community, all of you, are also critical in making these programs possible. Amerind's members, donors, visitors, museum store shoppers provide Amerind with the income that allows us to fulfill our mission, a mission that we realize in offering completely free public programs like this one you are enjoying today. Thank you. Thank all of you for your help. Without that support of our generous members and donors, Amerind would not be able to do our work. If you would like to join this generous Amerind community but haven't yet had the chance, please visit Amerind's website for membership and donation information. No nonprofit institution, no museum can do its work without a community of people like you. Now it is my honor to introduce to you Dr. Jennifer Nez Denetdale, a professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico, the author of Reclaiming Diné History, The Legacies of Navajo Chief Manuelito and Juanita, 2 books for young adults. She has published numerous essays, articles, and book chapters. She has been recognized for her scholarship and service to her nation and community with several awards, including the Rainbow True Colors for her support of advocacy on behalf of Navajo LGBTQI youth, the UNM Sarah Brown Belle Award for service to her community, and UNM's Presidential Award of Distinction. She is the recipient of the Women's International Studies Center Fellowship and the Newberry Consortium of American Indian Studies Fellowship, both in 2019. In 2020, she was awarded the University of New Mexico's 6th Annual Community Engaged Research Lectureship. Dr. Denetdale is the chair of the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission and has served on the commission for over 10 years. If you would like to ask any questions during the program today, please type your questions into the question and answer chat box. We'll be gathering those questions to share with Professor Denetdale over the course of today's program. Thank you once again for joining us today. Thank you for being with us, Professor Denetdale, and sharing such a personal story that I know has been the focus of your writing quite extensively for the last several months.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank the Amerind Institute, Annie and Eric for first for that wonderful invitation, and the wonderful introduction. I'm really pleased to be once again hosted by Amerind, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. I am Jennifer Denetdale. I introduced myself in the proper way as a Diné woman by my clans. I am originally from Tallahatchie, which is about 20 miles south of the border town Gallup, New Mexico, and I am presently professor and chair of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. I am also the chair of the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission, whose work on Diné funerary studies and practices of death and grief, stories of death, grief, and renewal have been part of one of our research projects. And the Human Rights Commission has worked very closely with our vice chair and traditional practitioner, Steve Darden. So I'm deeply grateful for the work that we're doing on the commission in support of our people. So this story that I'm sharing, this work that I'm sharing with you is a work in progress. It's one of the first pieces that I'm working on that really moves me away, I think, from academic writing. I'm an academic, and there's a certain kind of writing that some people might think is dry and, overly rigorous maybe. And so I've moved towards what I hope is a creative nonfiction kind of writing. My aim is for a 100-page narrative, for which I will. I'm about 62 pages into my 100-page narrative, and so I've had to stop and take a break and think about how I'm organizing this narrative. And so, what I'm sharing with you today is pieces of the narrative that I've written up to this point. You're listening to me and maybe sharing comments or questions. I take into account, and it helps me to think about how my writing is coming and how I'm shaping my narrative. So I appreciate any thoughts or comments or questions that you have. So this is a story of about the death of my mom by cancer. And, this helps me to think through and work through my grief, as well as to think about how our family, our extended family, moves on as our elders, my mom and my dad, have passed on and have left their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. We have become the oldest generation, the second oldest generation in our extended family. So I'm going to start now. I'm checking the time here so I can leave a little bit of time for questions. The ordinariness of each day is comforting. At dawn, right before the sun appears on the horizon to begin its daily journey across the sky, I am often awake, and even though a city is often considered never sleeping, there is a quiet of the dawn. I listen to the silence, get out of the bed, let the dogs out, and then take a pinch of white cornmeal, walk outside, face the east, and say my prayer to the Indine, the holy ones. I thank them for the beauty of the morning and for life. I pray that the day will be filled with beauty for me. I pray for my relatives and wish them blessings. I thank them that I had parents, and I thank them for the gift of my parents' lives. It hasn't always been that I was a prayerful person. As I reflect on writing about how to write about my mom's diagnosis of cancer, her courageous will to live, and then her death, I turn to prayer to reflect on what it means to write about my mother. 4 years earlier, my father died after a year on hospice care. Both of my parents died in our homes, dad in my sister's home, and mom in my home. Death and grief are difficult topics to raise in Diné company, even though our people have largely become accustomed to Western and Christian practices around death, which is already a desecration. We allow funeral homes and mortuaries to prepare the bodies of our relatives for burial, and we follow Western and Christian practices for services that are now common sense. Few of us have a memory of how our ancestors thought about the end of life, the care of a body, and then its return to the earth, what my dear brother Steve Darden calls replanting the body. As I've heard many times over the years as I was growing up on Navajo land, it was yi-ya to speak of death. To speak of death or to harbor grief and sadness at the loss of a loved one invited sickness, depression, and even death. For the Diné, speaking about death requires protocols, so it's difficult to speak about the end of life as a part of the natural cycle of all life. When a relative dies of a disease, there can be shame and guilt because it seems that the caretakers did not do all things possible to heal the patient, meaning that ceremonial knowledge was not invoked. Writing about my mom's cancer, her death, and my father's death offers space to explore how Diné formerly thought about death, the afterlife, and the care of the body. Writing helps me to temper my grief, and ultimately, I find that I remember the best of what my parents cared about, that their daily lives of caring for a family of 7, their love for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are about the practice of love and hope and renewal. And so in this paper, some of the things that I want to cover in this excerpt that I've taken from this narrative that I'm working on is my mom's diagnosis and ultimately her death, telling life stories, reflections on my mom and dad's own life, because they were ultimately, I think, the first generation who experiences changes in Navajo life in the aftermath of livestock reduction of the 1930s and 40s. My father was born in 1930 and my mom was born in 1934. And ultimately, their lives reflect the vast transformations that Diné experienced during this time. And so this offers space for me to reflect historically. I am a historian by training, to reflect on their life and how these things in history shape their lives as well. I also want to think about elder care and responsibility and accountability when we reclaim practices around mortuary issues. So my mom died from the radiation therapy to treat her cancer after 3 months on March 31st, 2019. It was right at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and she had heard her children, me, my 2 sisters, and my brother talking about the origins of the virus and the beginning of a shutdown that would last over 2 years. She never voiced her fear or what she thought about the possibility of dying. She thought of life and she had a will to live. Mom's primary language was Diné, the Navajo language, and I heard her and my dad speak our language my whole life, but they never required or expected me or any of their children to speak our language. The forces of the boarding school era of the 1930s and onward had marked how they parented. I searched for ways to translate from the English language into Diné the concept of cancer and its treatment. It's a delicate topic for elders like my mom, who was a dignified woman, Navajo woman, and who rarely spoke of death. In Diné, cancer is Rainbow Naatsiilid, or the sore that does not heal. The Diné word to translate cancer is of an early coining because it was not a disease known to our people until development came to our lands. The natural resources extraction of mining coal and uranium. My mom's cancer was my family's first personal experience with a disease. Feeling that I was wholly inadequate to translate to mom the doctor's diagnosis of stage 3 vaginal cancer, I asked my sister, my mom's sister's sister, to come and help us with translation so that mom could make decisions about her treatment, about her life, and the possibilities of death. My sister was a trained healthcare worker who often assisted families with language translations and was called upon by medical doctors and nurses to translate diagnosis, recommended treatments, and in some cases, the possibility of death. It's difficult to inform a Diné with cancer or diabetes about preparing for the end of life. As she related to me, she would sometimes be met with anger and incredulity that she would even dare to speak such pronouncements, for Diné believed that words have power, and speaking of the doctor's diagnosis brought her rebuke. What followed mom's diagnosis was her decision to seek treatment, and for the next 3 months, from December 26, 2019 to March 31st, 2020, my mom chose to come to Albuquerque, mostly because I lived there and I would be able to do her care. Mom was in and out of hospitals and cancer treatments in Gallup and Albuquerque, which saved us in traveling and waiting hours to medical appointments, money on gas and food, and it was the best option for her comfort. For Diné who live on the Navajo Nation, treatment for diseases like cancer is not available nearby, and so patients must travel to border towns or cities. Like so many other services, cancer treatment is available only in border towns like Gallup, 20 miles south of our home place near Tohatchee, New Mexico, and we must travel to Farmington, Flagstaff, or Albuquerque. Any of these choices require hundreds of miles of travel each week. Mom's courageous decision to seek treatment in hopes of life was brutal, and I reflect back on those months and the cost of her treatment. Multiple costs, including how cancer treatment is often regarded as its own torture chamber, and cost in terms of the medical expenses, of which our family still don't know the amount spent for her treatment and care. My family, principally two of my three brothers, two sisters and my brother who's the youngest of my siblings, provided care for our elders for about 20 years. I consider us fortunate that our youngest sister lived in her own home near my parents, and my older sister and brother lived with mom and dad and provided not only care, but company as our parents aged. My older sister, Jenny, had raised her own two sons as a single parent in Salt Lake City until they came of age and started making their own lives. Our brother, who is the youngest of five of us, spent at least 20 years in cities seeking a living until one day he was no longer able to support himself on the wages offered in the restaurant industry. For several generations now, our people make their way to towns and cities in search of making a living. On the Navajo Nation, we must continually look to those places for our survival because of the lack of an infrastructure on the Navajo Nation. Our elders often lament about their children and grandchildren who have left to seek opportunities in the towns and cities beyond the Navajo Nation's borders. Elders fend for themselves because their children and grandchildren have left, leaving them to fend for themselves. On the Navajo Nation, the economy is so underdeveloped that we depend on border towns for even the most basic necessities of food, shelter, water, clothing, jobs, and medical needs. The search for ways to support ourselves in these places have systematically robbed of places that have been systematically robbed of its resources, has left the Diné struggling to live on our land. Today on the Navajo Nation, we face a crisis of our young people continuously migrating to more border towns and urban areas, a condition of life that manifests in elders who live alone. In the time that our parents needed us, we adult children created a network of support for them, and we cared for them at in our homes until their deaths. So in the time since my mom's death in March 31st, 2019, I take this time, to write this narrative as space to reflect on my parents' lives. I'm an academic and I'm used to solitude and silence. I'm used to long hours of doing work in isolation, research, sitting in archives, writing. And so this is part of my time to reflect, and it offers me space to think about my mom's death and the meaning of my mom and dad's lives. My parents came of age during a major upheaval in Diné life when the federal government, via Indian Commissioner John Collier, mandated draconian livestock reduction policies in the 1930s. Collier called for a 50% livestock reduction of sheep, goats, and horses as the means to address denuded land. Based upon decades of non-Indian reports since the 1880s, the land could not support the vast herds on which the Nez depended upon for meaningful life. Livestock reduction was not only a catastrophe, but its implementation required federal officials who relied upon multitudes of experts to plan with them a transformation of Navajo life. The introduction of Collier's program to re-engineer Navajo people through rehabilitation programs were intended not only to improve the land, but to impress on Diné all kinds of technologies to improve our lives, from our political structure to our health, to our network of kinship, marriage and family included. My parents were children during this upheaval, and they experienced many of the government programs. They were sent to boarding schools where they were taught about American civil life and expectations of men and women. They returned to Navajo land after they were married in Sturt, Nevada, where they had met at Sturt Indian School and boarding school. And so my parents' lives, the way in which they parented, were also indicate or reflect to me the ways in which they were also boarding school survivors. As a child, my parents were also, as a part of these programs, the introduction of boarding schools, my dad's expectations that his children would speak English, that we would be successful in terms of what an American education could provide, what people call assimilation, which I call form of genocide and ethnic cleansing. My dad's insistence that his children speak English and speak English well are reflected of this era in their lives. It's also reflected in that the expectations that my dad would become a wage worker, which he did. He was fortunate in that he was able to find a job on the Navajo Nation. And he worked, I think, about 25 years with El Paso Natural Gas Company. My mom's training at Sturt Indian School in Carson City, Nevada, was both of their trainings, their education was gendered, and that my mom's training was domestic training, that she was taught at the school the expectations of a dutiful housewife. And so I think about that. I write about that in that time when, as children, when my father began working with El Paso Natural Gas Company, the experiences of school, the experiences of living in employee housing in Navajo Station, which is one of the El Paso compounds where housing was provided for the employees. And so I write about that. And I think one of the things that made an impression on me on many things is a 2-room schoolhouse that I went to, that was provided for the children of El Paso's employees. The school hosted 2 classrooms, one for 1st through 3rd grade and the second room for 4th through 6th grade. Each classroom held several shelves of books, and in the summertime, one of the employees arranged with the white teachers to have a library where we children could check out books. Once I learned to read, I went through all of the available books quickly. When I was promoted to 4th grade and went to the next classroom, I finished the Basel Reader in a matter of days and waited patiently during reading time for the other students to catch up. My parents were attentive to the teachers who stayed for years to teach their mostly Navajo charges and follow any directions from the teachers. They participated in all of the school's events, provided Christmas gifts for the student gift exchange each season. The 2 teachers, a retired Navy commander and his wife, were elders when they came to Diné. Their love of education was evident in the care they took in their lessons for their Brown charges. They established a physical education program. This was around 1966. And my older teacher says they were influenced by President John F. Kennedy's message about the importance of physical education. Every day, each grade had gymnastics, and we were introduced to its basics. The older kids learned how to use the pommel horse. At Christmas time, we demonstrated our new skills to our parents in a gymnastics program. And to ready for the gymnasium for the program, we children spent hours making poinsettias out of red, green, and white construction paper and gluing them on paper and then placing them in the room that served as the gathering place for students and parents. It's these two teachers, along with my parents, that provide me with the foundation for my devotion to education. Let me check the time here. In my grieving, I search for the roots of hope and optimism. And I find these in my relationships that my parents spent their life building. At the foundation of their years of care for their children, for their family of 5 children, my mother and father practiced the traditional healing and Native American church, the peyote way, as the philosophy for their home. They weren't much for words, and I never heard the Diné phrase, "Che'we ayoninchne." These are the words reserved for the love of parents to their children. More accurately, the love a mother expresses to her children. My parents, maybe because they were raised in such precarious times and in their own childhood was filled with uncertainty and loss, didn't express verbally their dedication and love for their children. And yet, as I reach elder stage myself, a grandmother now, and am thinking about retirement from my position at UNM, I turn to my parents' expression of Ashene through my memories of my childhood and then the care of my parents, which my siblings and I took on. Diné have another saying, and this saying in Navajo, the phrase, and I can't say it here, I didn't spell it correctly, means that when you have been brought up in care and love, and you yourself become an adult and an elder, you will turn around, you will turn back, and you will support those who have supported you. And that is one of the purposes of having children, of being a parent and then being a grandparent, is so that we will turn around as adults and care for our parents and grandchildren. Somehow in my stumbling around as a young adult and then becoming middle-aged, I managed to take my part in the care of my parents in their old age and in their successive illnesses. I share my stories to think about how mothers make possible our dreams. Mothers made our dreams possible with their burden of care. And I think about what are these life-affirming practices that my parents did on a daily basis. 2 weeks and about 3 months after my mom's death, this summer, last summer, in the summer of 2022, I traveled through Diné and I listened to our traditional knowledge holders. Listening to our elders requires listening. I require multiple listening in our own language. Otherwise, I don't retain it. It may be maybe because I don't trust my Diné Bazad fluency. So many stories have their own context, and it's told to us to fit the moments of our concerns and interests. I had the opportunity to listen to one of our traditional practitioners, Anthony Lee, this summer when I was visiting at a gathering place in Farmington. Mr. Lee shared about medicinal plants, but he talked about other things that were related. I've heard so many stories of the newborn child who became the mother of the Diné, the holy people who is the mother of us, the holy being who's the mother of us all. Mr. Lee shared this story in Diné Bazad. He said, first man heard a newborn's cry and followed it until he came upon the child. He picked her up and took her to his wife, first woman. She spied the baby and took her into her arms, and she said, Ashenesha away, and cradled her with delight. The holy people came, and one of them made her laugh by waving his rattle at her. He waved his rattle at her again, and she laughed again. The sound of her laughter was so delightful that the Holy One turned it into a song that is sung at the blessing way. As I take in the wonder of this story, my imagination takes flight as the scene unfolds before the first woman and first man, so delighted with their infant daughter. Her development into a young woman when she becomes changing woman, as Denetdale, is commemorated with the Kinalda, the puberty ceremony when women come of age. Lee explained that the words of love a mother expresses for her children is the ultimate expression of endearment. To say I love you in our language is reserved for children, and in its saying, declare that one will do everything in one's power to protect and care for a child. It is not endearment sent to a spouse, for we cannot own or control a person related through marriage. Lee's story is a story my dad told me several times. When I heard Lee's version, I thought of my mom, who in retrospect was always selfless. She spent her life caring for her husband and children. My parents told me that when they married, they agreed to a partnership where dad would work outside the home and mom provide for the family and care for the home. Mom more than kept her side of the agreement. Years of caring for dad and a growing family of 5 people, 4 daughters and 1 son. Mom had 2 other children, a son and a daughter, both of whom died in infancy. My memories of my mom are not of words we exchanged or conversations we had. I remember conversations with mom later in my adult life. Instead, memories of her are about her doing the work of a mother and wife. Mom tells me that she was raised by her grandmother, who also cared for her brother Sherman, whose mother was her mother's sister. We often visit the two one-room stone structures near my mom's home, where my mom spent her childhood. She loved her father, Gilbert Dennison, very much. Her father died when she was a child. He died from tuberculosis, which in the 1930s was an affliction that many didn't experience. Her father had deserted his wife when he followed another woman to Crystal, where she lived. At least a year later, he returned and asked his wife to take him back. She refused, and as my mom told me, her mother's heart had been broken by his abandonment. I wonder how my mom's life might have been, what might have been like if her mother had allowed her husband to return. When her mother took a new husband, mom and her siblings stayed with their grandmother. Mom told her stories with laughter about how as a child, you never returned home without every single sheep, that she walked behind the sheep all day across the hills to grazing places and to watering holes. She told me, probably so that I might learn a lesson. I never spoke back to my mother. So I have a couple more things that I just want to talk about death and the work of the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission on this issue. Within 3 months and after her treatment, I'm just checking my time here again. Within 3 months and after her single treatment of chemotherapy, her body was so destabilized and had become even more frail. The radiologist had recommended 30 treatments of radiation aimed at her pelvis. Every morning for 30 days, my mom and my sisters and I helped prepare for the ride to the radiology lab. We tried to fix a breakfast she would eat, clean her, and fix her hair. Each day she returned and slept. We had been told that after a radiation treatment, she would sleep. In the last month of her life, as she grew weaker and lost weight so that her body was skeletal, sometimes she panicked and screamed her pain. Most of the time, she kept her fear and exhaustion and pain to herself. Sometimes my sister crawled into bed next to mom and held her. Hours of care made me numb and determined. My sister did the daycare and I did the night care. In the last 3 weeks, we didn't have the physical strength to move her from the bed to the wheelchair and place her in the car from a ride to the radiology. Our youngest brother then came to stay with us so that he could do the heavy lifting. My sister's husband, who had always been compassionate and caring towards my parents, came and put in a temporary ramp on my porch. My oldest son came to visit his grandmother and take her to the hospital. We had laughing moments with Mom. In the last week of her life, my sister came back from a visit with the oncologist, who informed me that Mom had 1 week to a month left of life. 1 week to a month of life left. Standing outside in front of my house, as my sister told me in a quavering voice, I felt my head split and the sunlight brightened so much that I couldn't see very well. A few days before she died, my mom's last words to me were, "Am I going to live?" Tears filled her eyes as she asked me. I cried and held her. There were no words adequate in English or in Denetdale to convey to her impending death. To this day, I go over those moments of her looking at me with tear-filled eyes. It has been 2 years, and it's been almost 3 years now since my mother died from cancer. I was not expecting the weight of that grief that I felt for 4 months from January to April 2022. I thought that my mourning ran its course in the months after her death and the anniversary of her death. In the months when I felt the loss of my mother, every morning at dawn, I woke fresh in grief. Dawn is the time when the Diné goes out and greets the dawn with an offering of either white cornmeal or tadadin. The Diné word na'in means to make an offering for blessings. In the months after her death, I felt relief because of her suffering. Her suffering was measured in her courage and will to live. Mom had a fierce determination to live, as if the will was enough to dissolve the cancer that had invaded her body so brutally and with viciousness. In the days after her death, I prayed most mornings. I'm not an especially prayerful person, but rather one who appreciates prayers, and especially those who have the stamina and the grace to pray every day. So it was a thing when I offered white cornmeal early in the morning, and I called out to the Diné that I was grateful to have had a mom. I thanked them and my ancestors for her, and my dad. I thought of her years of toil, her care for her family, her 5 children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren. It is a full life to put the needs of others always before your own. I wonder sometimes what her desires were, what made her the happiest, what were her dreams. I wondered what it was like to be so selfless. I want to end here on a couple of things, but I want to turn to the work of the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission, which we had begun probably a year before my mom's diagnosis. But I just want to share a couple of pictures here. This is the place where I'm from. This is about 4 miles, east of Tohatchee. This is the place that my ancestors returned from Huelte in 1868. That mountain, we call this place the Bebetwo, which means sheep springs. We share stories of my parents. This is my dad's favorite truck. It's a 1966 Ford, and he drove it until it just couldn't go anymore. He was a master mechanic, and he put in rebuilt the engine so many times. And so my nephew took it and is hoping to fix it. This is a picture of my mom early in their marriage. What I want to turn to put this one on here, and I don't know if Honorable Steve Darden is present in this talk, but I beg his indulgence for using these photographs. The Navajo, and if you know, I don't know if Annie can find, if she would go to the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission's webpage, on the left side of the Navajo Nation Human Rights webpage, there's a link to a study at the Commission's study on Navajo funerary practices. And so the Commission, as part of our directive from the Navajo Nation Council, to address discrimination and racism that our citizens experience in border towns and cities, one of the predatory practices is funeral services, which is one of the most costliest items, purchases that Navajo citizens make. There are almost all of the border town funerals are off the Navajo Nation. I think there may be 2 Navajo funeral directors. There's a person who really helped us guide our study, as well as our Vice Chair, Steve Darden, which is Toby Benali, who owns a native crafts business, and he started making caskets to accommodate his people. And you have to understand this is very difficult to talk about for our people. And so we started this study of, for me as a historian and someone who's always interested in justice for our people, for me, one of the project's goals was, first of all, to illustrate and to demonstrate funeral service practices as predatory. And second, that a majority of us have come to accept, as I said at the beginning of my talk, Western and Christian practices around death, how we think about death, concepts of death, how the preparation of the body and placing the body in its final resting place have all largely become Western and Christian practices. And so we did the study. And then in the second phase, which to me is the most transformative and generative, is when, following our efforts to reclaim our knowledge, our traditional knowledge around death, the afterlife, and practice, our Honorable Steve Darden, who is a traditional practitioner, whom I call my brother and is the Vice Chair of the Commission, was awarded a Luce Indigenous Knowledge Fellowship so that he could do the next phase of the project, which is to gather traditional knowledge from traditional practitioners about our knowledge and our practices. And so last week on Tuesday, Vice Chair Darden gave a presentation at the Winter Rock at the Navajo Nation Museum. And so I took this picture of him getting ready to talk about his research, his methodology, and some of the stories that he had collected. This is happening in the 2 years. He was awarded in 2021. And so this starts in, his work starts in during COVID. And so it made conditions very trying for him. He tells the Commission that he has driven over 16,000 miles in his vehicle, in his truck, to meet with traditional practitioners. He has been allowed to only record 2 of the traditional practitioner stories. This is pretty fascinating to me as a researcher because he must relegate all of what he's been told into his memory. This is the time of the year, the season, to talk about these issues of death and grief and hope. And so Vice Chair starts his stories with talking about the constellations, and the black figure is the representation of the sky, our Father. The brown one is the representation of the earth. Okay, and so the constellations he has there, here you can see, represent the constellations and the stories that are part of understanding what death and trauma and grief mean from a traditional Diné perspective. Those are not my stories to share. Those are Vice Chair's stories to share. And I just wanted to point this out, that this is part of the process that we're working on in terms of reclaiming this knowledge. When my mom died, right at the very beginning of the pandemic, the funeral homes were starting to close down, shut down to their usual practices. There was reports, there's on YouTube, the funeral director from Tuba City who's in tears, you can see it on YouTube, talking about how the bodies are piling up and he's had to rent or bring in a refrigerated trailer because he just can't get to the deaths. We also have issues on Navajo Nation, which are ongoing and which our Navajo leaders are addressing at the moment in terms of available land for cemeteries and Navajo places where Navajo people have common burial sites. And so all of these issues come forth as I'm doing this work. At the end of, in terms of, after the presentation that Darden did at the Navajo Nation Museum, my sister attended with me. The room was filled with elders and I'm sitting there in the front, and the elders, I can hear them murmuring in approval. And the first person who comes up to share his comment with us, his reaction, is filled with emotion and gratitude. And he thanks Vice Chair Darden, our relative, for doing this project. And he said, this opens up space to talk about what we shouldn't talk about, what we can't say about a person once that person has left. This person did the kind of care I did for my mom and dad that me and my sisters did for our parents. And Vice Chair tells me that when an elder dies in your home, it's an honor and it's a blessing to be there. And that when a person dies that long, that in going towards old age or old age, it's a time to be joyous and to celebrate them, because they've walked the path of old age to happiness. You know? And so those were words of renewal and hope for me as I'm doing this project. So I want to end here because I want to leave enough time. I'm up to 11:48. Let's see. So part of this, as I'm thinking about these stories that I'm sharing and I'm writing this, I'm thinking about the natural cycles of life, of which death is a part. We have stories, Diné stories about death, about grief and trauma, and how to begin to heal. For these are also parts of our stories and practice for healing, for hope, for love and renewal. I'm going to end here and say that this project, writing this narrative, gives me cause to think about my own parents, about our need to create, recreate, and support, create a support system of love and care, of care and love based on kinship. That there's that we have the capability to do this for ourselves, for our relatives, and for our elders. We need to reclaim our responsibility and our accountability for the bodies of our relatives once they have passed. After Darden's talk on Wednesday last week, I walk out of the museum. The sky is overcast with gray billowy clouds, and the ground and the pavement is damp, a female rain sent by the holy people. It is good to remember our holy people, our ancestors, and our relatives who have left. They are alive in our everyday prayers and practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think on behalf of all of us, thank you for sharing such a personal and difficult story, and how inspiring it is that you find directions to take this that benefit others. There are some questions coming in for you. One of the questions is, while you're dealing with these personal issues of your mother's passing, and the Navajo Human Rights Commission was dealing with predatory funerary practices and these other discussions, were those things all happening at once? Was what you were experiencing influencing the work of the commission, or was the commission influencing you as you were thinking through these trying times?
You know, it was both, because we started on this. My brother Steve Dart and I were just of the same sentiment. This was like 5 or 6 years ago, because we're dealing with multiple issues that are about discriminatory and predatory practices, business practices, and one of them is funeral homes. So we started with doing the research, and I found, if you look in the study, I found that we held a series of public education seminars for our people to start, just to get public feedback, and we talked about current practices. We had hoped that more people would be willing to, they share with us privately some of the things that have happened to them, that some of them that are often predatory, but also we're also dealing with the bureaucracy of the Navajo Nation's land use policies. And we had hoped that we would get more so that we could build a larger case, you know. So this is happening prior and then during the course of what happens to my mom's death, and then what we had learned up to that point in dealing with funeral homes also shaped and helped my own family, so that we had a direction, we knew what to do. Because this is the first time that we've had to, this is my father's death, and then my mom's death is actually the first and second times that my family have, my immediate family, my sisters and my brother, we dealt with this directly. So they kind of informed each other.
Thank you. Sandra wants to convey to you that her thanks for sharing your truth, that this has been a difficult discussion, but she very much appreciates it. Marie wants to say to you, thank you for sharing this difficult story. And then she has a question. If the collection of traditional knowledge cannot be recorded, can it later be written down, or can it only be transferred orally in the future?
I think that that's what we're talking about right now. We're talking about how to disseminate the knowledge and then the accompanying practice to our people. The Navajo Nation's leaders are grappling with it right now as they consider changes in land use policy. How do we gather it? Do we do it only in our own language? Do we do it in English as well? I'm a researcher, and I structure things, content a different way than traditional knowledge holders might, you know. So these are questions that we're talking about right now and that I'm thinking about. And so when you're doing this kind of work in a community-based kind of a way, not one person says, oh, well, let's do it this way, you know, but there has to be a lot of discussion. There has to be a lot of decisions that are made that are collective. And so collective takes a lot longer than, you know, just one person saying, I'm going to do it this way, I'm going to do it this way, you know. So, but ultimately, what I have found from what's been gathered at this point is just the amount of tremendous compassion and love and generosity that the healers have in being willing to share this knowledge, and for Darden to collect it, gather it, and share it.
There's a question about your manuscript. What is your hope for the manuscript that you shared for us today, and how you see it coming to fruition and being shared?
I do have an Indigenous press interested. This is December. I have 68 pages. I want it to be 100 pages. And so I think it was 2 weeks ago I had time. I mean, I'm working full time as a professor in a chair, and I have other projects that I'm working on. So I think 2 weeks ago, I spent 4 hours on just 6 pages. And I'm like, well, I don't know how long this is going to take me if I need to structure. And I don't want to write anymore until I've structured the 68 pages that I have. So I have a press. I've read memoirs for 2 years, and Indigenous creative nonfiction and fiction as well in preparation for this. I'm also reading some work on trauma theory, and grief. So it's moving along, and things just take time. I mean, when I think about this project that I think it's been 5 or 6 years where we've gotten to the point where Darden has done the work of the research and the methodology, which just fascinates me.
A question again about, here's one. A question from Agnes. Thank you for your story. Discussions of death, loss, grief, and celebration are important, especially with the high loss of elders and family due to COVID.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think Navajo Nation should address grief and loss as we move forward after COVID?
What was the last part of the question?
How do you think Navajo Nation should address grief and loss as we move forward after COVID?
One of the things that, one of the topics that I've been reading about is elder care and the politics of care. During COVID, and this is in the newspapers, 40 elders died in the nursing home in Winslow. Elders died in the nursing home in southern Utah, the Blanding nursing home. Okay, so our leaders are aware. One of the things that I've heard leaders say is that we need to build nursing homes and rehabs inside of the Navajo Nation. I don't think that answers the question of our losses and thinking about the future. One of the things that I think is really important is to create space and a network system, kinship network system, where there's people available across generations to care for elders. Somehow, I think about my parents and my inadequacies as a daughter and as a granddaughter, that somehow we managed to put together care for them, so that we took care of them at home. That requires people who are going to be at home. It requires some kind of support, and so that's something that I've thought about a lot, that the answer is not nursing homes. The answer is not institutionalizing them. The answer is to create a support of care. For my dad, I volunteered and insisted that I would do the night watch. And so every night I sat with him. You also, when we did the talk on last Tuesday, a couple of people in the audience, Navajo people, who said also we need to pay attention to hospice care and palliative care for elders as well. And so I think I'm always thinking about the larger picture, that what I experienced in my own life with my parents is also informed by larger issues. And one of them is elder care, which is really critical right now on the Navajo Nation.
Another question focused on your writing. You started out by talking about that you're an academic writer and that this is a personal manuscript you've been working on. Was it hard for you to switch gears to such a different way of writing?
I guess I'll find out by first of all, you're my first audience to hear this. So your reception.
Thank you. I'll just show you. Thank you right there for sharing that with us.
Yeah, you're my first audience, and so that reception is important. Your response and your gauging of how well I'm making this transition is also useful to me.
All right, and we are coming up on noon. So Jennifer, I want to thank you so much for all the different ways that you share and all the incredible work that you do for people all over this nation, including your own, but our nation at large. We really appreciate you taking the time here at Amerind to share with our audience today.
Thank you.
I want to remind the people on the call that there will be a follow-up email after this talk. And as Jennifer has prompted us, we will provide a link to the Human Rights Commission website and the report that she was speaking of earlier. And Charmaine says, thank you from Hawaii, Jennifer.
We have had interest from people from other nations who share their experiences of how they're dealing with practices around death and grief and healing and burial protocols as well. And so we learn a lot from each other of how the transformation and the reclaiming of knowledge.
Thank you all for being here. Please be safe, please be well, and we are wishing you all the best to you and yours. Take care.